Okay, so, when you really try to understand something like fear and trauma, it can get kind of intense. There's just so much information out there, so many theories, so many approaches. It's really easy to get lost in the weeds. And that's kind of what we're here to do today, right? Help cut through some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not just here to throw around jargon, it's about really getting down to the nuts and bolts of what's going on in our brains and bodies when we're talking about fear and trauma.
Right, exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at the work of neuroscientist Andrew Huberman. He's got some really fascinating insights into the modern neuroscience of all this, how fear works, what trauma really is, and how we can potentially use this knowledge to move forward. So think of this as your guide to understanding the inner workings of your own nervous system, so to speak, and more importantly, what that can unlock for you.
And what I think is really fascinating here is that grasping this stuff, these neurological underpinnings, it's not just like an intellectual exercise. It's actually like the first step in developing strategies for navigating fear and trauma, strategies that can have a real impact.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Fear, stress, anxiety, trauma. We hear these words all the time, but biologically speaking, are they all the same thing? What does each one actually mean?
Yeah, it's a great place to start because there are real differences. Let's think about it like building blocks. So fear, in its complete form, it actually sort of builds upon stress and anxiety. So let's start with stress. Stress, at its core, is just a physiological response, right? Your heart might beat faster, breathing changes, your focus narrows. It's like your body's on switch. And
Yeah.
it's totally physiological. Doesn't even need a specific fear trigger.
So that feeling of being on edge before something big, even if you're not necessarily afraid of it, that's just stress.
Yeah, exactly. Now, anxiety, that often comes in as stress about something that might happen in the future. Like, you're anxious about that presentation you have to give because you're anticipating all the things that could go wrong. So again, you can have that anxious anticipation without clear and present fear.
Right. So stress is like that immediate physical response, and anxiety is more like the mind kind of worrying about what's to come. Where does fear fit into all of this? What does it really mean?
Fear, it brings together both those physical and mental elements we've been talking about, but it's usually triggered by a perceived threat, right? And that threat, it can be real and present, or just something your brain interprets as dangerous. Then there's trauma. To really understand how to approach it, we need a clear definition, a working definition. So think of it like this. Trauma is like a fear response, but it's become so embedded in your nervous system that it gets reactivated in ways that don't really make sense. Like
Yeah.
even when the danger isn't there anymore.
It's like someone who's a panic attack, seemingly out of nowhere. When they wake up
hmm
with no obvious trigger.
Yeah, that's a good example. It's like that deep-seated fear that's still playing out even when the person is safe. And it's worth mentioning here briefly, phobias and panic attacks. Phobias are these super intense fears of very specific things, and panic attacks are sudden surges of fear, but without a clear cause. They're definitely related to all of this, but today we're focusing on that core mechanism of fear and how it can lead to trauma.
Okay, so now we've got a clearer picture of what these terms really mean biologically speaking. So what's actually happening in our bodies when we're experiencing fear? You always hear about the fight or flight system, but what does that actually involve?
Yeah, so that fight or flight response, it's all about the autonomic nervous system. And that controls all these automatic functions in your body that you don't really have to think about. Digestion, heart rate, and really importantly, how you respond to stress and fear.
Right. Keeps us alive without having to consciously think about it all the time.
Exactly. And it has two main parts. So first you have the sympathetic nervous system. This is like your alertness system
hmm
or your action system, you could say. It's like hitting the gas in a car, speeds things up, increases your focus, gets you ready to
The
move.
body's go button, essentially.
Exactly. And then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calming system. And this is like your brakes. Helps you relax, slow things down, come back to a state of balance. And these two, they work like a seesaw, constantly adjusting how alert or how calm you are.
So ideally, those two are balanced.
Right, exactly. That's the goal. It lets you be energized when you need to be, but also relaxed when it's safe.
Okay, that makes sense. So when we're stressed or scared, that sympathetic side kicks in. But there's also that HPA axis we always hear about. What does that actually do?
Okay, so the HPA axis, that stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And it's a key player in how we respond to fear, especially in those longer lasting effects. Let's break it down, right? So the hypothalamus, that's a region in your brain that controls those basic drives, hunger, thirst, and also, really importantly, stress. And it talks to the pituitary gland, which releases hormones into your bloodstream. And those hormones signal your adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys, to release stress hormones.
Like adrenaline?
Exactly. Adrenaline, also called epinephrine, is what gives you that immediate boost of energy, makes you super alert. But then there's cortisol, and that has these longer-term effects on your body. So the HPA axis, it uses this whole chain of command, brain to hormones to body, to get you ready for a challenge or what you perceive as a threat.
Okay, so it's not just about that immediate rush of adrenaline.
Right. What's really important to understand is that it's got those fast-acting components thanks to adrenaline, but then cortisol creates this longer-lasting effect. And that's why the feelings of fear or trauma, they can actually linger for a while after the initial event.
So that lingering feeling of being on edge, even after a stressful situation has passed, that's the HPA axis still doing its thing.
Exactly, yeah. And it gets even more interesting because the HPA axis can actually influence which genes are expressed, in your brain and your body. And that's one of the ways fear can become so deeply ingrained, like a habit. But, and this is crucial, this also means there might be ways to actually undo that.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. So it's not just a temporary response. They actually change things at a deeper level. Okay, so now we know what's happening in the body. What about the brain itself? What are the key parts of the brain involved in how we experience fear?
So the amygdala, it's not just one thing. It's these two small almond-shaped structures, and they're deep inside your brain. And they are absolutely central to how you respond to fear. Think of them as a core part of your brain's threat detection system. When they're activated, they set off this whole cascade of responses in your brain and body. Heart rate goes up, you become hyper-aware, you get that surge of energy, and they actually suppress those brain systems that are responsible for keeping you calm and relaxed.
So it's like the amygdala is the initial alarm bell that goes off.
Yeah, exactly. It plays that critical first role. But it's important to remember that the amygdala's threat response, it's a little bit, I don't know, I guess you could say dumb in a way. It's not super specific. It doesn't really differentiate between different types of threats.
It doesn't know if you're facing a tiger or a public speaking event. It just knows threat.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why fear learning can be so broad. We can become afraid of almost anything if that threat system is active when something happens.
That explains why some people develop fears that seem, to others, completely random.
Absolutely. And all this information from your memory, your senses, what you see, hear, smell, it all feeds into a particular part of the amygdala. And then the amygdala, it has these output pathways, One goes straight to the hypothalamus and the adrenal glands, and that amps up those feelings of alertness, preparing you for action. Another pathway goes to a region called the PEG, the periaqueductal gray, and that can trigger defensive behaviors like freezing, which you see in a lot of animals when they're scared, or a fawning response, which is more about trying to appease a threat, and it can even trigger the release of your body's natural painkillers, the endogenous opioids.
The body's own morphine, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that can create this feeling of emotional numbness.
So that numbing effect, that's the body trying to protect itself in really overwhelming situations.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And the amygdala, it also connects to the locus coeruleus, which is in the brainstem, and that releases adrenaline and similar chemicals, but directly into the brain. So that further increases your overall arousal. And here's the interesting thing. The amygdala, it even talks to the dopamine system.
Really? That's surprising. The fear center of the brain is connected to the reward pathway.
Yep. Seems kind of counterintuitive, but that suggests that we might actually be able to use the reward system to change those fear memories.
Wow, so that's a potential avenue for, rewiring those responses. Okay, so we've got the amygdala sounding the alarm. But what about the prefrontal cortex? Doesn't that play a role too?
Oh, absolutely. The prefrontal cortex, it's right at the front of your brain behind your forehead, and it's all about top-down processing. That's our brain's ability to consciously control those more automatic reflexive responses. Like imagine you touch a hot stove.
Instantly pull your hand away.
Exactly. That's a reflex, but you can actually override that reflex, even though it would be uncomfortable. Same thing when you jump into cold water, right? Your body wants to gasp and get out, but you can override that. That's the prefrontal cortex.
This is like the brain's executive control center.
You got it. And through language, through the stories we tell ourselves, the prefrontal cortex gives meaning to those basic fear responses from the amygdala. The feeling itself, it's just a physiological thing. But what that feeling means to you, how you choose to react, that's where the prefrontal cortex comes in.
So you might not be able to stop the feeling itself, but you can control what it means and how you respond.
Precisely.
Okay. So we've talked about the brain's fear system, how it works. But how does it actually learn what to be afraid of, and how does it remember those things?
That's where the idea of fear as a memory system comes in. Dr. Kerry Ressler, he talks about memories as protective and memories as dangerous. Our fear system, it's wired to make really strong memories of past experiences, so we can avoid those threats in the future. And the main way this happens is through Pavlovian conditioning. Or classical conditioning, it's the same thing.
Like Pavlov's dogs.
Exactly. With the dogs, the food was the unconditioned stimulus, naturally made them salivate. And the bell, that was the conditioned stimulus. It started out neutral, but by pairing it with the food again and again, the bell eventually made them salivate all on its own. So with fear, the unconditioned stimulus might be something inherently dangerous, like a loud noise or pain, something that automatically triggers a fear response. And the conditioned stimulus, that could be anything that was there when that bad thing happened. A place, a smell, a sound.
So it's about association.
Yes. A neutral thing becomes linked with that fear. And what's really powerful about fear learning is that it often happens with one-trial learning. Unlike learning a skill, which takes practice, one really bad experience can create a really strong fear association almost instantly.
Like a bad public speaking experience.
Exactly. That one event can make someone terrified of public speaking, or a bad relationship can lead to a fear of intimacy. And the fear system can generalize. So, like, getting your car broken into in a certain parking garage could make you afraid of just that garage, or it could turn into a fear of parking garages in general, or even a fear of that whole city.
So it can go from very specific to super general.
Yeah. And it can also work the other way. Lots of small negative experiences can build up and create a more general sense of anxiety or fear.
So it can be like a sudden, intense thing or a gradual buildup.
Okay, so
Fear is learned, which means it can also be unlearned, right? That's where neuroplasticity comes in.
absolutely. Neuroplasticity is the brain's amazing ability to change. It can change its structure, its function, all based on your experiences. And this often involves changes in the strength of the connections between neurons, the synapses. And during fear learning, there's this process called long-term potentiation, or LTP, where those connections get stronger. There's a particular type of receptor, the NMDA receptor, and it's really important in this process. When those receptors are activated strongly, it basically solidifies the fear memory.
So LTP is like making those fear pathways in the brain more robust.
Yeah, think of it like that. But here's the good news. It can also work in reverse. There's also long-term depression, LTD, and that's where those connections get weaker. And that's super important for fear extinction, for unlearning fear.
So LTD is like weakening those fear pathways.
Exactly. And that's where therapy comes in. Therapies like prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, or CPT, and cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, they all use different techniques, but the core idea is to help facilitate fear extinction. So by repeatedly and safely re-experiencing the memories of those traumatic or fearful events, people gradually see their anxiety response lessen over time.
It's like you're presenting the conditioned stimulus, the memory, but without the unconditioned stimulus, the actual danger.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And for some people, journaling about these events can also help, especially if they can't access therapy. But it's important to approach that with caution. Re-engaging with trauma without support can be really overwhelming. But a crucial point here is that fear extinction by itself, it's often not enough.
Really? Why is that? If the fear response is reduced, shouldn't that be the goal?
Well, the insight here is that we also need to replace those fear memories and responses with something positive. Remember that connection between the fear circuit and the reward system, the dopamine system. We can actually use that. Like, think about a kid who was in a car accident on the way to a soccer game and then develops a fear of biking, playing sports, anything like that. Extinction therapy might help reduce their anxiety when they think about those things. But to really move past it, they need to re-engage with those things and build new positive associations.
So you're not just erasing the fear, you're replacing it with good feelings.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the prefrontal cortex. Those higher level circuits can act like a brake on that automatic threat response. So when we have positive experiences and connect them to that traumatic memory, we're basically rewriting the story. We're not forgetting the accident, but we're layering new rewarding associations on top of it. So it's a three-part process. You diminish the old experience, you relearn a new narrative with positive associations, and then you link those back to the original traumatic event.
I see. It's about building that resilience, a new sense of safety. Okay, so what about EMDR? It's gotten really popular for treating trauma. How does that fit into all of this?
Yeah. EMDR, that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's definitely gained a lot of attention. The main thing with EMDR is that it uses side-to-side eye movements while someone is recounting those traumatic memories. Now, initially, the explanations for how it worked, they didn't really line up with what we knew about the brain. There were ideas that it replicated REM sleep or just activated both sides of the brain, but those theories didn't really hold up.
So there was a lot of skepticism about why it might work.
Right. But more recent research has shed some light on things. Studies, both in animals and humans, have shown that those side-to-side eye movements, they can actually directly affect the brain's fear circuits. Specifically, they seem to suppress activity in the amygdala.
Wow, so just moving your eyes back and forth can calm down that fear center.
That's what the research suggests. One theory is that those eye movements, they're similar to what we do naturally when we're moving through the world. And if you think about it, evolutionarily, moving forward and being terrified, those don't really go together. Fear is often about freezing or retreating, but those eye movements associated with forward movement, they might signal to the brain that it's safe to move on.
Like the body telling the brain, hey, we're not stuck anymore.
Exactly. And EMDR seems to be particularly effective for those single event traumas. But going back to our three-part model, EMDR seems to mainly address that first part, the extinction of that intense emotional response to the memory. Some therapists might incorporate things like cognitive restructuring and positive reinforcement, but that's not really central to EMDR itself.
So it might be really good at taking the sting out of a memory, but you might need other approaches to build new positive associations.
Exactly. It's an important distinction.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier how important social connection is. Can you talk a little more about how that actually works in the brain? How does being around others, feeling connected, impact those fear and trauma responses?
Social connection, it's not just a feel-good thing. It has a real neurochemical impact on how we experience these things. And you see this across many species. It's a fundamental part of our biology. There's a molecule called tachykinin. And after we experience something fearful or traumatic, this tachykinin gets activated in a specific part of the amygdala, and that contributes to anxiety irritability. And here's the thing. Social isolation, being alone, it actually increases those tachykinin levels in the brain.
So feeling alone after something bad happens can make the biological underpinnings of anxiety even worse.
It seems that way, yeah. But the good news is that positive, trusting social connection, it can actually reduce the effects of tachykin. Having conversations, sharing meals, appropriate physical touch. This really highlights how important social support is, not just for how we feel emotionally, but for what's actually happening in the brain.
So it's literally about changing the molecules in our brains.
Yeah, precisely.
We also briefly touched on the idea of trauma being passed down through generations.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean, biologically speaking?
This is a really fascinating area. What the research suggests is that we can inherit a predisposition to be more sensitive to fear and trauma, but it's not about inheriting specific memories. Dr. Kerry Ressler, he's done a lot of work on this, and he found that things like severe parental abuse, especially from the father, it can lead to changes in how genes are expressed. These are called epigenetic changes, and those changes can be passed down through sperm.
So it's not a direct memory. It's more like inheriting a system that's more sensitive to fear.
Exactly. It seems to be a sensitization of the glucocorticoid system, which includes that HPA axis we talked about. So these individuals, they might have a more reactive stress response. They might be more vulnerable to the effects of trauma. But, and this is important, it's a predisposition, not a destiny. Current treatments for trauma, they're still relevant and effective, regardless of whether someone has this genetic predisposition.
So it might make someone more sensitive, but it doesn't change the fundamental ways the brain deals with fear in recovery. Okay, so let's talk about some of the newer treatments for trauma. Things like ketamine and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. What do we know about how those might work?
Yeah, these are some really promising areas of research, especially for PTSD. So ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, that's legal for clinical use with a prescription. And then you have MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, which is still in clinical trials. Now, ketamine, it's a dissociative anesthetic. People often describe feeling detached, like they're observing themselves from a distance. And the research suggests that it might be working by influencing certain brain circuits, allowing people to process those traumatic memories, but with a different, less intense emotional experience.
Like it creates a sort of buffer emotionally.
Yeah, something like that. It might help with rewiring those memories, combining the extinction of the old fear with new associations. Now, MDMA, it's totally different. It increases levels of dopamine and serotonin, like way high. So people feel incredibly connected, euphoric, safe, comfortable, and it triggers a huge release of oxytocin, which is all about social bonding.
So very different subjective experiences.
Yeah, very different. The idea with MDMA-assisted therapy is that this state of heightened connection, safety, it can speed up that process of relearning, of forming new positive associations with those traumatic memories. So it's like compressing what happens in traditional therapy, making it much easier to approach those difficult memories.
So it's not like these drugs are magic bullets.
Right, but they seem to enhance those natural processes we've been talking about, that extinction and replacement, so it can make therapy faster, more effective for some people.
This is also fascinating. Now, how can someone know if what they're experiencing is more than just regular stress or anxiety? How do you know if it might be trauma?
Well, aside from those standard diagnostic criteria that mental health professionals use, there's this concept of the balance between interoception and exteroception. Interoception, that's your awareness of your internal state. Your heartbeat, your breathing, your gut feelings. And then exteroception is your awareness of the external world, what's happening around you.
So one is what's happening inside, and the other is what's happening outside.
Exactly. And in a healthy system, those internal responses, they're balanced with what's happening externally. But with fear and trauma, that balance gets thrown off. So even minor external events can trigger these huge internal threat responses.
Like a small noise shouldn't send you into a panic attack.
Right. And there's a region of the brain, the insular cortex, that's really important in maintaining that calibration. It maps those internal sensations and relates them to what's happening in the world. When that's off, even mild things can cause these big reactions. That's when people feel constantly on edge.
So if you're feeling a really intense internal response to something that doesn't seem to warrant it, that could be a sign that something's off.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay.
And this leads to a really interesting area of research. Using controlled exposure to stress and breathing techniques to recalibrate that system.
Wait, intentionally stressing yourself out.
It might sound counterintuitive, but there's been some really interesting research on this. Studies with animals have shown that repeated but short periods of intense stress can actually resolve some of the negative effects of chronic stress, like depressive-like behaviors. And in my lab, we've been looking at how brief breathing exercises can impact stress in humans. Things like physiological sighs, which are really calming.
So like a double inhale and a long exhale.
Yeah, exactly. But we've also been looking at cyclic hyperventilation, which is short bursts of intense breathing with breath holds, and that actually increases that autonomic arousal. So you're intentionally putting yourself in a stressed state, but in a controlled way.
So it's like the key is that it's deliberate, it's controlled.
Yes. My colleague, Dr. David Spiegel, he always emphasizes that it's not just the state you're in, it's how you got there. Did you choose to be there? The idea is that by doing this deliberately, engaging that stress state through something like cyclic hyperventilation, you're activating those higher level prefrontal circuits. And that could actually strengthen your conscious control over those automatic fear responses. It's like training the brain to better regulate itself.
So it's like exposure therapy, but for your internal state.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. It's about teaching the brain to respond more appropriately to what's happening, both inside and outside.
This has been an incredibly detailed and fascinating look at the neuroscience of fear and trauma. As we wrap up, what are the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember?
The big thing is this. Understanding how fear and trauma work, biologically, it gives us a real foundation for finding effective ways to heal. We talked about the different layers of fear, the role of the nervous system, the HPA axis, those key brain regions like the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, how memory and conditioning play into all of this. And that it's not just about reducing the old fear responses, it's about building new positive ones.
And we talked about some really exciting areas of research, like those drug-assisted therapies and those brief, self-directed stress techniques.
Right. And I think a really important question to leave you with is this. How might understanding your own internal responses and your ability to control your state of arousal change your relationship with fear, both past and present? Explore these ideas of interoception and maybe even those controlled stress techniques, always with caution, of course.
And as always, if you're struggling with fear or trauma, reach out to a qualified professional. Thank you for joining us at this deep dive.